In August 1993, Michael Jackson was the most famous person on Earth. By October, the story had changed completely. What almost nobody has examined since is how fast it changed, how coordinated it looked when you trace it back, and who was ready the moment it did. Well, if you've watched our previous video on Michael Jackson's full story, you already know the broad outline. This video goes much deeper into 1993 specifically, the recordings, the legal maneuvers, the physical evidence, and the media machine that turned an unresolved civil dispute into a cultural verdict that no court ever actually delivered. Because what the record shows about 1993 is not the story most people think they know, and the distance between those two things is where this entire legacy was decided. Ask most people what happened in 1993, and you'll get a version of the same story. A child came forward. Michael Jackson was accused of something terrible. He paid the family millions of dollars to go away, and that payment, that settlement, was proof enough. Case closed. Guilty. The music career stumbled, recovered, then collapsed again in 2003 when the whole cycle repeated. 2 strikes, no smoke without fire. That version of events has been repeated so many times across so many platforms, by so many voices, that it has the texture of established fact. It is referenced in documentaries, in academic papers, in casual conversation, as the settled background against which everything else about Michael Jackson gets evaluated. But here's what that version never explains. Why would an innocent person pay? That's the question the story relies on. It treats the answer as obvious. And for most people who encountered the story through headlines rather than legal records, it felt obvious. What that question never gets is a serious answer, because a serious answer requires looking at what was actually happening legally, financially, and strategically in the months after the allegations surfaced. And when you look at that, the actual sequence, the actual documents, the actual positions of the parties involved, the obvious answer stops being obvious almost immediately. The public version of 1993 begins in August, when the allegations became news. But the private version begins months earlier, and that distinction is everything. Evan Chandler was a dentist in Los Angeles. His son Jordan had spent significant time with Michael Jackson through a friendship that had developed over the previous year. By the spring of 1993, Evan Chandler had become increasingly unhappy with his son's relationship with Jackson, and increasingly unhappy with his own relationship with Jordan's mother, with whom he was engaged in a bitter custody dispute. In July 1993, Evan Chandler had a conversation with a family friend named David Schwartz. That conversation was recorded. The recording was obtained by multiple journalists and became one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the entire case. Discussed and then largely forgotten, buried under the avalanche of coverage that followed. In that recording, Evan Chandler is not describing a father who has just discovered something horrifying about his child. He is describing a plan. He talks about what is going to happen. He talks about the media attention that will follow. He talks about the impact on Michael Jackson. He uses language that, read in full and in context, is very difficult to interpret, as the spontaneous reaction of a protective parent responding to a disclosure. The specific lines from that recording have been reported on by multiple outlets over the years. What they show is a man who, months before any public allegation, appears to be describing an outcome he is actively working toward, not one he has stumbled into. That recording existed. It was reported on. It did not meaningfully change the trajectory of media coverage. What happened next was this. In August 1993, Evan Chandler took Jordan to a psychiatrist. During that session conducted after Chandler had administered sodium amytal, a sedative, to Jordan during a dental procedure, Jordan made allegations against Michael Jackson. The use of sodium amytal, a drug with documented effects on memory formation and suggestibility, was noted at the time by defense investigators. It was not prominently featured in media coverage. The allegations were reported to law enforcement. The story broke publicly within days. And from that moment, the machinery moved with a speed that left almost no room for anything as slow and complicated as evidence. What happened in the weeks after the allegations became public is one of the most instructive examples in modern media history of how a story can calcify into narrative before a single fact has been established in any legal proceeding. Both the coverage was immediate, saturating, and almost entirely constructed around the assumption of guilt. The word allegedly appeared in early reports. It disappeared quickly. By the time the story had been running for 2 weeks, the framing in most mainstream outlets had shifted from Jackson accused of to a tone that treated the accusation as the conclusion. There are structural reasons this happens. Journalism operates on deadlines and competition. A story this large, involving a subject this famous, creates enormous commercial pressure to advance the narrative, to add new details, to be first. The careful language of legal uncertainty is commercially inert. The confident language of revelation drives traffic, sells papers, generates viewers. Several of the journalists who drove the 1993 coverage had existing frameworks for Michael Jackson that preceded the allegations. Diane Dimond, whose reporting at Hard Copy became central to the story, had been pursuing Jackson-related stories for years. The allegations of 1993 arrived into a media environment where several key figures had already concluded something and were looking for confirmation, not investigation. The result was coverage that had the structure of reporting but the function of prosecution. Sources close to the Chandler family were given prominent placement. Jackson's denials were framed as predictable and therefore suspicious. The FBI involvement, which would ultimately run for years and find no basis for federal charges, was barely mentioned in the initial coverage cascade. What the public received was not information from which to form a judgment. It was a judgment packaged as information. But here's what most people never heard, because it appeared in the record and then disappeared from the coverage. Jordan Chandler provided investigators with a description of Michael Jackson's body. That description included specific physical details intended to be verifiable, details that, if accurate, would constitute significant corroboration of the allegations. But when investigators subsequently conducted a physical examination of Michael Jackson, a deeply invasive procedure that Jackson described as one of the most humiliating experiences of his life, the description did not match. The specific physical characteristic Jordan Chandler had described was inconsistent with what the examination found. This was documented. It was known to investigators at the time. It was reported on by a small number of outlets in the immediate aftermath. And then, in the avalanche of subsequent coverage, it essentially vanished from the mainstream narrative. The significance of this cannot be overstated in terms of what it means for the evidentiary foundation of the 1993 case. A key piece of purported corroboration, the kind of physical detail that would be extremely difficult to fabricate and that investigators specifically sought to verify, did not hold up when examined against the physical reality. That outcome, in any serious legal proceeding, would have been a significant problem for the prosecution's case. But it was not a serious legal proceeding, because 1993 never became a criminal trial. And the reason it never became a criminal trial is itself one of the most misunderstood elements of this entire story. Then it's the sodium amytal question. The drug Evan Chandler had administered to Jordan during a dental procedure before the allegations emerged has a documented history in forensic contexts. Sodium amytal, sometimes called truth serum in popular culture, does not reliably produce truth. What it reliably does is increase suggestibility, the receptiveness of a subject to leading questions and external influence. Memories formed or articulated under its effects are not considered reliable in legal context for exactly this reason. The involvement of sodium amytal in the period immediately preceding Jordan Chandler's disclosure was documented in defense filings. It received minimal mainstream coverage. The question of what effect, if any, that drug had on a 13-year-old boy's account of events was never examined in a criminal proceeding, because criminal proceedings never happened. In January 1994, Michael Jackson settled the civil lawsuit brought by the Chandler family. The settlement figure was approximately $23 million. The settlement contained no admission of liability or wrongdoing. Those last two facts, no admission, no liability, are not legal boilerplate. They are substantive. The American legal system explicitly recognizes that defendants settle civil cases for reasons entirely separate from guilt. Litigation is expensive, disruptive, and unpredictable. The discovery process alone, the legal mechanism through which both sides examine each other's documents, records, and witnesses, can cause damage independent of any ultimate verdict. For someone in Michael Jackson's position, with a global entertainment business, ongoing tour commitments, and a public profile that was already being shredded by daily coverage, the calculus around settlement involved factors that had nothing to do with what actually happened. They're onto him. This is not a controversial legal concept. Civil defendants with no liability settle cases every day. Insurance companies do it routinely. Corporations do it routinely. The legal system's explicit position is that a settlement is not a confession. Courts do not treat settlements as admissions. Attorneys advise clients to settle cases they would win at trial when the cost of winning exceeds the cost of settling. But what made Michael Jackson's settlement different in the court of public opinion was simple. The story was too good, too large, and too commercially valuable to complicate with nuance. Settlement equals guilt was a clean narrative. The actual legal meaning of a civil settlement without admission of liability was not. The criminal investigation that had been running parallel to the civil case continued after the settlement. It ultimately did not result in charges. The Los Angeles District Attorney's Office declined to prosecute. The reasons included the evidentiary problems the physical examination had revealed, the complications around witness reliability, and significantly the fact that Jordan Chandler, once the civil case was settled, declined to cooperate with the criminal investigation. That last detail is worth sitting with. The central witness in the 1993 allegations chose not to participate in the criminal process that would have been the actual mechanism for establishing what happened. Without that cooperation, the criminal case could not proceed. The DA's office closed the investigation. This outcome, no criminal charges, no trial, no conviction, received a fraction of the coverage the original allegations had generated. By the time the investigation concluded without prosecution, the cultural narrative had already set. The settlement had been read as confirmation. The lack of charges was treated as a technicality rather than as a substantive legal conclusion. Here is what 1993 did to Michael Jackson. Beyond what the headlines recorded, loafers. It demonstrated that the machinery of accusation, media coverage, and financial pressure could be deployed against him with devastating effect, and that the actual legal outcome was almost irrelevant to the damage inflicted. The story had already been written. The charges that were never filed, the physical evidence that didn't corroborate, the recording that suggested premeditation, none of it caught up with the narrative that had been established in those first weeks of coverage. Financially, the settlement and the surrounding legal costs were significant. But more significantly, 1993 established a template. It showed what was possible. It showed that allegations alone, regardless of what the evidence showed, could produce a $23 million outcome without a single day in a courtroom. It showed that Michael Jackson's public image was a pressure point that could be exploited for leverage. Whether 2003 was a repetition of that template or something genuinely different has never been examined with the seriousness it deserves. What is documented is that the 2005 criminal trial, the actual legal proceeding that 1993 never produced, resulted in not guilty verdicts on all 14 counts, and that the jurors who delivered those verdicts described a case riddled with inconsistencies, witnesses whose credibility they found severely lacking, and evidence that did not meet the standard required for conviction. By 2003, when new allegations surfaced, the 1993 settlement was already embedded in the public mind as proof. The new jury was instructed to evaluate the 2005 case on its own merits, but the public had no such instruction, and for the public, 1993 had never ended. It had simply been waiting for confirmation. Jordan Chandler, years later, reportedly told his father he had not been abused. The reporting on this, based on accounts from people familiar with the family, appeared in several outlets. It received minimal coverage compared to the original allegations. By then, the narrative had been running for over a decade. A single report of a recantation was not going to move it. Kevin Chandler died in 2009. The same year as Michael Jackson, from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The recording of his 1993 conversation, the one where he appeared to describe a plan before any allegation became public, remained in the record, largely unexamined by the mainstream coverage that had built an entire cultural consensus on the story. That recording complicated the truth, as it almost always turns out, is far more complicated than the headlines ever made it seem. 1993 was not the year Michael Jackson was exposed. It was the year the machinery that surrounded him demonstrated what it could do. What it could not do in the end was produce a criminal conviction, because criminal convictions require evidence, and the evidence, when it was actually examined in a courtroom 12 years later, was not what the headlines had promised. Whether you find that conclusion satisfying, or whether questions about Michael Jackson's private life remain unresolved for you, the story of 1993 is not the story you were given. The recording existed. The physical examination found what it found. The criminal investigation produced no charges. The central witness did not cooperate with prosecution. Doubt and Squirrel. Those are the facts. They were always available. Almost nobody ever put them in the same sentence as the $23 million settlement that became the only number anyone remembered.